It all begins with a silence that has lasted nearly 2 decades. A silence that, according to those who knew him best, Trevor Engelson carried like a weight he could never set down. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the Hollywood producer avoided interviews about his ex-wife Meghan Markle, refusing to comment on her meteoric rise, her royal marriage, or the controversies that followed her every move. He never spoke a word publicly, even when the world seemed desperate for his side of the story. But now something has changed. Something inside Trevor seems to have broken free, and whispers from his inner circle suggest that he's finally ready to reveal what he's been hiding. The secret that Meghan allegedly forced him to bury 19 years ago. The story, as it's now unfolding, doesn't begin with palaces or cameras or crowns. It begins in the shadows of Los Angeles in the early 2000s, when Meghan Markle was not yet a duchess, not yet a household name, just an ambitious young woman with a dream and a plan. Back then, she was still finding her way in Hollywood, attending auditions, working odd jobs, and climbing the social ladder in search of recognition. Among the many faces that crossed her path during that period was one man who would later become the ghost in her story, Joe Giuliano. Their connection, once rumored to be romantic, has remained shrouded in mystery. But now, what Trevor Engelson is reportedly exposing could rewrite everything the public thought they knew about Meghan's early life. According to emerging accounts, Meghan's relationship with Joe Giuliano wasn't just a fleeting Hollywood romance. It was something deeper, something that ended abruptly, leaving behind questions that never found answers. Some insiders claim the two had been more serious than anyone realized. Serious enough to consider a future together, and perhaps even to take vows. Others whisper that there was a child, a young girl whose existence was deliberately erased from Meghan's past as her ambitions began to sharpen. For years, these claims have lingered online, dismissed by some, believed by others, but no one close to Meghan ever confirmed them. Until, perhaps now, Trevor Engelson was not part of that chapter of her life, at least not in the beginning. But as Meghan's career evolved and her past began to resurface in quiet whispers, Trevor found himself drawn into the secret she desperately wanted to keep buried. Friends recall how Meghan was always guarded about her pre-Hollywood years. She would quickly change the subject if someone mentioned old relationships or her time before she became an actress. There were photos she refused to show, stories she never wanted to discuss, and people she suddenly cut out of her life without explanation. At first, Trevor thought she was simply private, protective of her image in a brutal industry. But one day something changed. The rumor goes that Trevor stumbled across documents, papers or photos that didn't match the timeline Meghan had always told him. There were names, perhaps Joe's, and possibly references to something else, something larger, maybe even a marriage record or communication about a child. No one knows exactly what Trevor saw, but those who were close to him at the time say he became distant afterward, confused and heavy with unspoken tension. When he confronted Meghan, the argument that followed was said to be explosive. She begged him to keep quiet. She reminded him how fragile her career was, how easily everything she'd worked for could be destroyed if the past resurfaced. In that moment, Trevor made a decision that would haunt him for years. He agreed to stay silent. That silence became the foundation of their relationship. Meghan built her public identity on a carefully crafted version of herself. One that erased every inconvenient detail, every connection that didn't fit the story of a determined young actress fighting her way to success. Trevor, meanwhile, learned to play his part. The loyal husband who smiled in photos and supported her ambitions. But inside, he carried the weight of what he knew. The secret was no longer just Meghan's. It was theirs. And for nearly 2 decades, he kept it locked away. Now, as reports circulate that Trevor has begun to speak privately about those years, the world is asking the question that has long lingered in the corners of royal gossip. What exactly did Meghan make him hide? Sources close to Trevor suggest that his breaking point came not from bitterness but from exhaustion. The exhaustion of watching the woman he once loved reshape her past entirely while he bore the burden of her hidden truth. In private conversations, he allegedly confided that the secret involved more than a forgotten relationship. It involved a child, a daughter, and a desperate effort to destroy any evidence of her connection to Joe Giuliano. The claim is staggering, one that, if true, would explain the extraordinary lengths Meghan has gone to control her image since her Hollywood beginnings. In the middle years of their marriage, Trevor reportedly became aware that Meghan was paying close attention to anything that could trace her back to her old life. She hired publicists known for image sanitization, experts in removing traces of online photos, college stories, or old acquaintances. Some of her friends from the early days began to notice that certain photos and social media mentions disappeared without explanation. A few even received quiet requests to unshare or delete anything from her early 20s. On the surface, it looked like a rising actress wanting to appear more polished and professional. But according to Trevor, the real motive was far deeper. If there was indeed a hidden past involving a relationship with Joe Giuliano, or worse, a wedding, then every piece of evidence, every trace of that chapter had to vanish. Trevor allegedly told a confidant that Meghan once said, "No one can ever find out what happened before." Those words became a mantra, a warning, and a promise. He kept them in silence, protecting her even when their marriage began to crumble. And when they finally divorced, he continued that silence out of something that was no longer love, but fear. In the years that followed, Meghan reinvented herself completely. From Hollywood to humanitarianism, from actress to duchess, her transformation was total. She emerged with a new identity, a new narrative, and a new power. One that depended on the world believing in her story. But as Trevor's new revelations begin to surface, that story is under threat like never before. Because behind the glamour and the royal titles lies a hidden life, one that was buried under nearly 2 decades of secrecy. The middle of this story unfolds not in palaces, but in the quiet ache of conscience. For years, Trevor tried to move on, producing films, starting a family, building a new life far from the shadow of the monarchy. Yet, according to insiders, there were moments when he couldn't escape it. When Meghan and Prince Harry made headlines for their royal exit, for their interviews, for their claims of truth-telling, Trevor reportedly confided that he found the irony unbearable. He once told a friend, "She talks about honesty and freedom, but look at what she made me hide." Those who heard him say it claim his voice was calm, but his eyes told another story, one of deep regret. If the secret he carried truly involved a child, a daughter conceived long before Meghan's rise to fame, then Trevor's silence becomes something more than loyalty. It becomes complicity. It becomes a burden that grows heavier with every passing year. For 19 years, he stayed quiet, even as the narrative around Meghan became mythological. But now, the rumor is that he's finally done hiding. After all this time, he's ready to tell the truth. Not out of revenge, but out of release. The ending of this introduction brings us to the threshold of revelation. The pieces are aligning. Meghan's early Hollywood life, her connection to Joe Giuliano, the mysterious disappearance of records, and the man who knew it all but stayed silent until now. Trevor Engelson's alleged confession is not just about the past. It's about the cost of keeping secrets for someone who built an empire of image. It's about how far a person will go to protect the version of themselves the world adores. And perhaps most hauntingly, it's about what happens when that version begins to crack. Because now, after nearly 2 decades of silence, the truth Trevor has carried may finally be coming to light. And if even a fraction of what he's revealing is real, then Meghan Markle's story, the one the world thought they knew, might just be rewritten forever. But what exactly did Trevor find that convinced him to keep quiet all those years? What proof existed? And how did Meghan ensure it disappeared without a trace? Those answers, according to what's now emerging, are far darker than anyone could have imagined. And they take us back to a chapter Meghan believed was long dead and buried. And yet, as we're about to uncover, some secrets refuse to stay buried. Meghan Markle's story is often told as one of ambition and transformation. A woman who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most recognizable figures in the world. But before the polished speeches, the red carpet appearances, and the royal headlines, there was another chapter few have ever seen. It was a time when Meghan was not yet the Duchess, not even Rachel Zane from Suits, but simply Meghan, a young woman navigating the unpredictable streets of Los Angeles, trying to make something of herself. And in that chapter, A man named Joe Giuliano stands at the center, a man whose name has been whispered for years, yet carefully scrubbed from Meghan's public timeline. Joe Giuliano was not a Hollywood powerhouse, not a royal, not even someone the tabloids cared to follow. He was ordinary, a businessman by reputation, and described by those who claim to have known him as kind, steady, and fiercely private. Meghan, on the other hand, was full of restless energy, the kind that burns through everything in its path. When they met, she was still working small modeling gigs, appearing in briefcase scenes on television, and hustling for auditions that rarely paid more than a few $100s. Joe, it said, admired her drive. To him, she was magnetic, someone who spoke as if she already belonged in a bigger world. But what began as a quiet romance soon became something much deeper. Friends from that era recall seeing Meghan with Joe at events, always close, always protective of one another. There were rumors of an engagement, whispered among those who remembered her referring to him as the one. Some even claim there were photos, formal, elegant, possibly from a ceremony that looked suspiciously like a wedding. But over time, every trace of that period vanished. Old social media posts disappeared, photos that once floated around in private circles were taken down, and people who mentioned Joe Giuliano in connection with Meghan suddenly fell silent. It was as if that entire part of her life had been erased with surgical precision. The question, of course, is why? Why would someone go to such lengths to erase a man like Joe Giuliano from their history unless something far more significant had occurred? Some say the reason lies in a bond that went beyond romance, a secret that could have threatened everything Meghan would later become. Those whispers speak of a child, a daughter, born in the quiet shadows of a relationship that ended far too soon. If this claim is true, it would explain why Meghan, even in her early 20s, was so fiercely protective of her privacy. People who worked with her back then describe her as unusually cautious about her personal details. While other aspiring actors shared everything about their lives, Meghan was selective, strategic, and often evasive when questions turned personal. She controlled her narrative long before she had a platform large enough to amplify it. Joe Giuliano, on the other hand, faded from sight. It's unclear what became of him after that alleged chapter ended. Some say he moved away, others that he was asked to disappear, not physically but socially. That kind of silence doesn't happen naturally in the digital age. It requires effort, resources, and influence. And Meghan, even before she was famous, understood the power of reinvention. In those early years, she lived between two worlds, one foot in the small, struggling actress lifestyle and the other reaching toward a higher social circle. She was attending charity events, networking with agents, and meticulously building connections. Yet, according to certain insiders, there was always a tension around her past. People noticed how defensive she became when anyone mentioned her old days or anyone connected to them. She wanted the conversation to stay focused on her future, not her beginnings. That future began to take shape when she met Trevor Engelson. He was everything she needed at that moment. Established in Hollywood, charming, and experienced in navigating the entertainment world, Trevor was already producing projects, mingling with rising actors, and had a solid reputation as someone who could get things done. Meghan saw in him an opportunity for stability and credibility. For Trevor, Meghan was captivating, intelligent, articulate, and ambitious. He fell for her fast. What he didn't realize then was that he was walking into a story already half-written. Before long, the cracks began to show. Trevor noticed small inconsistencies in Meghan's stories about her past, things that didn't quite line up, dates that shifted, friendships that couldn't be verified, and moments that seemed carefully edited. Whenever he asked, she had quick answers, too quick, some might say. But love has a way of silencing suspicion. He wanted to believe her, and for a while he did. But the name Joe Giuliano never entirely vanished. It would surface in quiet moments, mentioned by someone from Meghan's early circle or hinted at in passing. Trevor once overheard a conversation about Meghan's old partner, who was never supposed to be spoken about. That phrase, never supposed to be spoken about, stayed with him. It wasn't normal, not even in Hollywood where secrets are currency. Something about it felt heavy, final, and deliberate. What Trevor didn't know then was how deep that silence ran. Joe Giuliano, by every account, had become a ghost in Meghan's story. The photos of them together were gone. The memories shared by friends were buried. Even online traces, the kind of digital footprint most people can't escape, had been systematically erased. It was as if a whole relationship had been wiped clean. And then came the rumors of a daughter. No one could say for certain, but some who were close to Joe claimed that he spoke once, just once, about a child he could never see. A young girl who resembled her mother in every way. The story was fragile, passed around in hushed tones. The kind of rumor that might have been dismissed if not for the meticulous way Meghan had sealed off that chapter. The more she tried to erase it, the more people began to wonder what she was hiding. As Meghan's star began to rise, the whispers grew fainter, drowned out by her success and her polished public persona. By the time she landed her role on Suits, she had transformed completely. Gone was the girl from Los Angeles struggling to make ends meet. In her place stood a poised, articulate woman with a new accent, a refined image, and a story of determination that inspired admiration. But behind that new image was a carefully constructed wall. One Trevor would later find himself staring at from the inside, realizing too late what it was built to conceal. Joe Giuliano remained an unanswered question, a name never mentioned in interviews, never acknowledged in official biographies, never referenced in the endless media coverage that followed Meghan's royal marriage. To this day, no one has been able to find verifiable traces of who he truly was or what his relationship with Meghan entailed. That kind of disappearance doesn't happen by coincidence. It happens by design. And if Trevor Engelson's emerging revelations are to be believed, that design wasn't just about erasing a man. It was about erasing a moment in time that could unravel the narrative Meghan spent years perfecting. He reportedly told friends that Meghan couldn't risk the world seeing who she was before the cameras arrived. That statement, cryptic and chilling, suggests that the story of Joe Giuliano and what they shared could have jeopardized everything that came after. So who was Joe Giuliano really? Was he a fleeting romance, a forgotten friend, or something far more significant, perhaps even a husband? Some reports claim that Meghan and Joe held a small, private ceremony years before she ever met Trevor. The details are hazy, unverified, and shrouded in speculation. But the pattern that follows erasure, denial, and reinvention mirrors what Trevor himself would later experience during their marriage. The middle of this chapter paints Meghan as someone on the edge of transformation, desperate to shed her old skin, terrified of being dragged back into it. The ambition that would one day take her to royal corridors was already burning fiercely inside her. And for people like Joe Giuliano, who once knew her before that transformation, there was no place in the world she was building. As for Trevor, his story with Meghan was only just beginning. But what he didn't know was that he was inheriting her secrets too. Secrets that would bind him to her long after their love was gone. He would soon discover that when Meghan closed a chapter, she didn't just move on from it. She buried it, burned it, and made sure it could never be rewritten by anyone but her. And yet, no matter how tightly you seal the past, it has a way of finding cracks. The truth about Meghan's connection to Joe Giuliano, and what might have followed from it, would resurface years later. Not through tabloids, but through the one man she thought would stay silent forever. But what exactly did Trevor discover about Meghan's early life that made him question everything? And what did he find that convinced him to stay quiet, even as that silence began to destroy him? The answers to those questions lie in the next chapter, where the whispers of a hidden daughter and a destroyed past collide with the one man who held the evidence all along. The whispers about Meghan Markle's alleged secret daughter have persisted for years, lingering on the edges of online discussions and resurfacing each time her past becomes a topic of renewed fascination. At first, they seemed like wild speculation, the kind of unfounded rumor that attaches itself to any public figure who becomes larger than life. But as time went on, a pattern began to emerge. Certain stories from her early life never quite added up, certain timelines didn't align, and certain people, like Joe Giuliano, appeared and vanished as if plucked out of existence. And somewhere in the spaces between those silences, there is said to be the faint outline of a child, a young girl whose very existence could have rewritten everything the world thought it knew about Meghan Markle. The alleged daughter story is one of the most haunting elements of this mystery. If it's true, she would be nearly 19 years old now, born in the early 2000s, around the same time Meghan's Hollywood journey was just beginning. That would place her birth long before Meghan's fame, before her marriage to Trevor Engelson, and before her life as a duchess. It was a time when Meghan was still trying to find her place in the world, a time of struggle, rejection, and relentless ambition. But it was also, reportedly, a time marked by decisions that would change everything. People who once knew Meghan during those early years describe her as deeply determined but restless. She wanted more opportunities, more visibility, more control. She often spoke about wanting to build something that lasts, though few realized just how literal that desire would become. One acquaintance, quoted in an old interview that later disappeared from circulation, recalled that Meghan was dealing with something personal back then, something she never wanted to talk about. When asked what it was, the source went quiet and said, "It wasn't my story to tell." That phrase has followed Meghan's narrative ever since. It wasn't my story to tell. But now, according to those close to Trevor Engelson, that hidden story may finally be surfacing. Trevor allegedly told close friends that during his marriage to Meghan, he discovered fragments of information that didn't fit the image she presented. He never spoke openly about it, but his behavior changed. He became quieter, more cautious. He once said, "There's more to her than anyone knows, and I can't be the one to expose it." Some have interpreted that as loyalty, others as fear, because what he might have found could have been explosive documents, perhaps photos, that hinted at something Meghan had worked tirelessly to erase. An earlier life as a mother. Imagine, for a moment, being Trevor in that situation. Married to a woman whose career was beginning to take off, only to find evidence suggesting she had concealed a child from her past. How does someone even process that? The first reaction would likely be disbelief, followed by confrontation. But those who claim to know what happened say that when Trevor asked questions, Meghan's response was immediate and emotional. She didn't deny everything outright. She redirected, reframed, and controlled the conversation until Trevor realized there was no safe way to keep asking. He once confided to a friend that Meghan's reaction was terrifyingly calm. She told him, "That part of my life doesn't exist anymore." It's a chilling sentence, one that suggests not just denial but deliberate erasure. From that moment onward, Trevor reportedly stopped digging. He didn't want to know more, and perhaps he didn't need to. The implications alone were enough. But the knowledge stayed with him, haunting him in quiet moments. Especially when Meghan began to speak publicly about her struggles with family and identity, painting herself as someone who had always been honest, transparent, and grounded. For Trevor, those words must have echoed painfully. As for the alleged daughter, her existence remains shrouded in ambiguity. There are claims, though unverified, that Meghan arranged for her to be raised privately, away from the public eye, possibly under another name. Some even suggest the child was placed with extended family or close friends, kept safe from scrutiny as Meghan built her career. Others go further, arguing that there is no child at all, that the story is a fabrication, born out of half-truths and misinterpreted whispers. But what makes the rumor endure isn't evidence. Its absence. The silence, the missing pieces, the unexplained gaps in time. Between 2002 and 2006, Meghan's documented history is curiously thin. Few photos, few public records, and very little verifiable detail about her relationships or whereabouts. For someone as social and visible as she later became, that kind of gap is unusual. It's as if an entire chapter was quietly rewritten before the world could notice. And if Trevor's alleged revelations are to be believed, that gap might be where the truth lies. One story that has circulated in Hollywood for years involves Meghan abruptly leaving a small modeling agency where she'd been working. According to an anonymous former colleague, She left without notice, claiming she needed to start over. The timing aligns almost perfectly with when the alleged pregnancy would have occurred. Soon after, she reappeared, polished, composed, and more focused than ever. She began to refine her image, shedding old contacts and even changing how she spoke, how she dressed, how she presented herself. To some, it was simply the evolution of a young woman finding her path. To others, it was a calculated rebirth. When she eventually met Trevor Engelson, she was already in control of her new identity. He fell in love with the version she presented, the ambitious actress, the kind-hearted humanitarian, the dreamer. He didn't know there was another layer, another story buried beneath that image. But as their marriage unfolded, small cracks began to appear. Trevor started noticing how defensive Meghan became about anything related to her past. She avoided questions about old friends. She discouraged him from contacting anyone who'd known her before her acting career took off. Once, when he found an old photo tucked inside one of her notebooks, Meghan allegedly tore it up on the spot and said, "You shouldn't have found that. If true, it paints a picture of someone living in constant fear of being discovered." And it raises the question, what kind of secret would require that level of control? The most logical explanation, some say, is not simply a forgotten relationship, but a hidden life event. Something that could completely upend the narrative Meghan would later sell to the world and the royal institution. If she had, in fact, been a mother long before meeting Prince Harry, it would mean every official biography, every royal document, and every personal statement about her past was incomplete. That possibility alone could explain her obsession with maintaining control over her image. For Trevor, this secret became an invisible wall in their marriage. He couldn't talk about it, couldn't ask about it, and couldn't forget it. He was trapped in a web of loyalty, guilt, and confusion. And yet he stayed silent for years. Even after their marriage ended, he kept his word. He never publicly criticized Meghan, never shared his side of the story. But those who know him say the silence came at a cost. It gnawed at him, especially as Meghan's fame exploded. Each interview, each headline, each portrayal of her as a victim of circumstance reminded him of the secret he still carried. The alleged daughter, if she exists, has grown up in complete anonymity. No photos, no verifiable records, no trace of connection. And maybe that's exactly what Meghan intended. A life untouched by scandal. A secret so deeply buried it would never threaten her success. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, especially when those who helped keep them start to question their silence. Trevor Engelson's rumored decision to finally speak about what happened is not driven by revenge, those close to him claim. It's driven by release, the need to free himself from a past he never asked to protect. And as that story begins to unfold, the alleged existence of a daughter becomes more than gossip. It becomes a symbol of everything Meghan fought to hide, the one thread that could unravel the image she spent years constructing. The whispers about the girl's existence remain unconfirmed, but they persist because they fit a pattern. Meghan's story has always been one of control. Control of perception, control of narrative, control of what the world sees and what it doesn't. And for Trevor, that control was suffocating. This part of the story ends not with answers, but with questions. Questions that echo louder now that Trevor's voice has entered the conversation. If there truly was a daughter, where is she? Who raised her? And most importantly, how far did Meghan Markle go to ensure no one would ever know? Because if even a fraction of these whispers are true, then the secret Trevor Engelson was forced to hide isn't just about a past relationship. It's about a lost chapter of motherhood, erased from history and hidden behind the glossy image of royalty. And the moment Trevor decided to stop keeping that secret marked the beginning of the end. For both of them. When Trevor Engelson first met Meghan Markle, he saw in her a spark that reminded him of every story Hollywood ever told about ambition. She was magnetic, charming, and disarmingly confident. At the time, Trevor was already making his way up the entertainment ladder as a producer, rubbing shoulders with people who had the power to make or break careers. Meghan, by contrast, was still searching for her big break, attending casting calls, juggling small roles, and networking at every social event that could bring her closer to the spotlight. Their connection was fast, almost cinematic. Friends remember them laughing together at industry parties, always tucked away in corners, whispering like conspirators. Trevor adored her energy. She wasn't just another actress trying to get noticed. She had a plan. She spoke about fame not as a dream but as a destination she was certain she would reach. It was that confidence, that sense of inevitability, that drew him in. To Trevor, Meghan wasn't just another hopeful in a sea of talent. She was different. She was deliberate. But behind the charm and drive was something else. A guardedness that even Trevor couldn't quite define. While she could talk for hours about her future, she rarely talked about her past. When he asked simple questions about her childhood or early relationships, she answered in fragments, pieces of stories that didn't always fit together. There were moments of hesitation, pauses too long to be casual. And though Trevor was too smitten to press, he noticed. At first, that mystery intrigued him. It made her seem layered, complex. He told a friend once that he liked how private she was. He thought it made her feel real, not another Hollywood stereotype desperate for attention. He had no idea that what he found intriguing would one day become the reason he could never truly understand her. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Within months, they were living together, balancing long work hours with late-night dinners and weekend getaways. Trevor would often surprise her with small gestures. A bouquet after a long day, handwritten notes left in the kitchen. Meghan, in turn, made him feel like he was the one who saw her, who understood her hunger for more. They were, in many ways, a power couple in the making, a producer and an actress building their lives side by side. But even in those early days, something about Meghan's behavior began to unsettle him. She was particular about what could and couldn't be photographed. When they attended events, she carefully selected what personal details she shared with others. Trevor once tried to take a candid picture of her at home, laughing in her pajamas. She made him delete it immediately, saying, "I don't want any photos like that floating around." It seemed harmless then, just a woman who valued her privacy. But over time, that attitude hardened into control. The turning point came one night when Trevor stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see. Accounts from those close to him suggest it happened during their first years together, sometime between 2007 and 2009. Meghan was out at a meeting, and Trevor was home, sorting through boxes of paperwork and old photos they'd been meaning to organize. Among the stack of documents was an envelope, unmarked, tucked deep inside a folder. Inside were a few faded pictures and what appeared to be an official-looking paper. Trevor never publicly confirmed what he saw, but those who knew him say that his expression changed when he spoke about it. One close friend recalled him saying, "I wish I hadn't opened that envelope." Whatever it was, it shattered his understanding of the woman he thought he knew. When Meghan returned home, Trevor confronted her, gently at first, unsure of how to ask what he'd just discovered. She froze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a calmness that startled him, she asked where he had found it. When he handed her the envelope, she didn't open it. She simply took it, walked to the fireplace, and tossed it into the flames. Trevor stood there, stunned, as the edges of the paper curled and turned black. The room filled with the faint smell of burning ink. When the fire died down, she turned to him and said, "That part of my life doesn't exist anymore. Do you understand?" He didn't. Not really. But something about her tone, the sharpness of it, the authority, told him not to push further. For the first time, Trevor saw a side of Meghan that wasn't charming or ambitious. It was cold, almost mechanical. She didn't plead or justify. She commanded. The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed would hang over them for years. From that moment on, Trevor became more observant. He noticed small inconsistencies in her stories, the way she would dodge questions about certain years, the people she never mentioned, the sudden irritation when old friends tried to reconnect. Once, during a dinner with mutual acquaintances, someone brought up a name, Joe Giuliano. Meghan's smile faltered. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Trevor caught it. She quickly changed the subject, excused herself, and didn't return to the table for nearly 15 minutes. When she came back, her demeanor was composed, but the evening ended early. After that night, Trevor began to connect the dots. The envelope, the name, the way Meghan guarded her past like a fortress. He didn't know the full story, but he knew there was something buried deep, something she was terrified of resurfacing. Over time, that fear began to affect their relationship. Meghan became increasingly controlling, particularly about what Trevor could share publicly. She would review photos before they were posted, scrutinize his interviews, and even request to read his scripts when his projects included themes of secrecy or betrayal. Trevor found it strange, as though fiction reminded her too much of something real. Despite the tension, they married in 2011. Their wedding was beautiful, intimate, and attended by close friends. To the outside world, it was the perfect union, two creative souls building a life together. But beneath the surface, Trevor was haunted by what he'd seen. By the night she burned those papers without hesitation. Their marriage lasted less than 2 years before it began to unravel. Meghan's career was gaining traction. Her social circles were expanding, and her sense of independence grew sharper. She started spending more time away, claiming it was for work, but even when she was home, she felt distant. Trevor once confided to a friend that it was like living with a stranger who's always performing. The final blow came when he realized that the woman he loved had built walls he would never be allowed to climb. The secrets were part of her, and she had no intention of letting them go. Meghan, for her part, began to see Trevor as a reminder of the life she wanted to escape, the unfinished story she was rewriting one calculated decision at a time. Years later, when asked about Trevor in interviews, she called him a kind man and said she wished him well. But to Trevor, those words carried a weight of irony. Kindness wasn't what defined their relationship. Silence did. And through all of it, that name, Joe Giuliano, remained unspoken between them, hovering like a shadow they both pretended not to see. By the time their marriage ended, Trevor understood that whatever secret Meghan had buried before they met was too large for anyone to carry alongside her. It wasn't just about ambition or reinvention. It was about survival, her version of it. And for Trevor, it became a story he was forced to live without ever being allowed to understand. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of echoing. Trevor's discovery of those papers was only the beginning. The real truth, the one that connected Meghan's past to her future, would surface later, in whispers, in quiet admissions, and finally, in the words of a man who had stayed silent for far too long. The question that haunted Trevor from that day forward was simple. What could make someone destroy the very proof of who they once were? The answer lay not just in Meghan's ambition, but in the deal she would make next. A deal that would silence Trevor, reshape their lives, and ensure that the secret burned in that fireplace would never see the light of day again. The night Trevor Engelson discovered the truth was the night everything changed. He would later describe it, according to a close friend, as the moment the floor fell out from under me. Whatever he found, whatever those papers contained, was enough to make him realize he wasn't just living beside an ambitious woman. He was living beside someone who had erased part of her own life. The following days were heavy with silence. Meghan avoided eye contact, moving through their Los Angeles home with a kind of deliberate calm. Trevor, on the other hand, was restless. His mind replayed every detail of that discovery. The smell of smoke as she burned the papers, the way she never looked back at the fireplace, the emotionless certainty in her voice when she said that part of her life didn't exist anymore. He knew then that he'd stumbled onto something dangerous, something that could destroy not just her carefully constructed image but both of their lives if it ever surfaced. First, Trevor tried to talk to her again. He approached her one morning while she was reading lines for an audition, trying to find a gentle way to reopen the conversation. "I just need to understand," he said. "Whatever that was, it's part of who you are. You can't just erase it." Meghan didn't respond. She kept her eyes on the script for a long time before finally saying, "You don't understand what's at stake." Those 6 words marked the beginning of an unspoken agreement between them. From that day on, they would not discuss what Trevor had found. It was a line neither of them would cross. But the silence came with conditions that would change the shape of their relationship forever. According to accounts from people close to Trevor, Meghan began to tighten control over their personal and professional lives. It started subtly. Small requests to avoid certain conversations, reminders not to bring up her past around mutual friends, gentle corrections when he mentioned things she considered private. Then the boundaries grew sharper. Meghan wanted to oversee anything that could be seen publicly, photos, interviews, even small talk at industry events. Trevor complied, partly out of love and partly out of confusion. He told friends that he felt caught between protecting her and protecting myself. At first, it felt like compromise, but slowly it began to feel like coercion. The deal, as insiders would later piece together, was simple in its design but massive in its implications. Trevor would remain silent about what he knew. About the man named Joe Giuliano, about whatever past relationship or child might have existed, about the documents he had seen. In exchange, Meghan would ensure that his career remained protected. She had connections, influence, and a growing reputation in Hollywood. But loyalty, Trevor learned, can become a prison. In those days, Meghan was beginning to attract attention from producers, casting directors, and high-profile figures. Her charm was undeniable. She could walk into a room and instantly make people feel she belonged there. Trevor watched her navigate those circles with calculated grace, always saying the right thing, always staying just vague enough to protect her image. He noticed how she introduced herself differently to different people. To some, she was the struggling actress trying to make it. To others, she was already a rising star. The story changed depending on who was listening. Behind closed doors, however, Meghan was tense. She would sometimes pace the living room late at night, phone in hand, scrolling endlessly through old contacts. When Trevor asked what she was doing, she'd reply, "Just cleaning things up." He didn't press for details, but he began to understand that she wasn't just cleaning her phone. She was cleaning her past. One evening, he overheard a conversation that confirmed his fears. Meghan was speaking softly on the phone, her tone urgent but restrained. "I told you to get rid of it," she said. "All of it. I don't care how, just make sure it's gone." When she noticed Trevor standing by the doorway, she hung up immediately. He asked who it was, but she brushed it off, saying it was nothing important. That night, Trevor couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the city outside their window, trying to piece together what it might be. Was she talking about the same documents she had burned? Was there more evidence out there, photos, files, messages that could expose what she had worked so hard to bury? Over the following weeks, small but significant changes began to happen around them. Meghan replaced her laptop, bought a new phone, and started using different email accounts. Friends from her earlier life stopped coming around. Even the few she stayed in touch with seemed uneasy in her presence. Trevor once overheard one of them whisper, "She's serious about making it disappear." Then came the moment that made everything real. Trevor was working late when Meghan received a package from a courier. She opened it quickly, then disappeared into the study. When Trevor walked in later, he noticed scraps of paper in the trash, pieces of a photograph and what looked like a legal form. She had torn them into tiny shreds, the kind you couldn't piece back together. When he asked about it, she simply said, "It's over now," and walked away. In that moment, Trevor realized that Meghan wasn't just hiding from gossip. She was systematically erasing something enormous. He didn't know if it was guilt, fear, or calculation driving her, but he knew it was dangerous. And so, he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He agreed to keep quiet. They never formalized it, never wrote anything down, but the understanding was clear. He would protect her secret. In return, she would protect him from the fallout. They would move forward as if nothing had happened. But silence, as Trevor learned, doesn't erase truth. It buries it alive. Over the next few years, Meghan's career took off. Her role on Suits changed everything. Suddenly, she was no longer a struggling actress. She was a star. Interviews, photo shoots, magazine spreads, her life was becoming public property. And yet, through it all, she maintained absolute control over what the world saw. When journalists asked about her early life, She gave perfectly rehearsed answers. When tabloids dug into her past, her PR team issued quiet denials. Trevor, meanwhile, stayed behind the scenes, watching the woman he once loved become someone he barely recognized. He attended events by her side, smiled for cameras, and played his part. But every time she spoke about honesty, transparency, and authenticity, he felt the sting of the secret between them. He knew then that what he'd agreed to wasn't a promise. It was a trap. He was protecting her at the cost of his own peace. The deal they'd made in silence had become a cage he couldn't escape from. When their marriage finally fell apart, the unspoken truth hung between them like smoke. They never revisited it, never acknowledged it. The divorce papers were signed, and Meghan moved on to a life that would soon make her one of the most talked about women on earth. But Trevor carried that secret with him, buried deep, until years later when the weight of it became too much to bear. He once said to a friend, long after their separation, "I thought keeping her secret would protect her. I didn't realize it would destroy me." Because what Trevor learned that night wasn't just about Meghan's past. It was about her capacity to rewrite reality. And the more she succeeded, the more he realized that truth was the one thing she could never allow to surface. What was on those papers? What proof was destroyed in that fireplace? And what did Meghan fear so deeply that she would silence the one person who knew the truth? The next chapter begins where silence ends, when Trevor's conscience starts to break under the weight of what he's been forced to hide. Trevor Engelson's silence had bought him peace for a while, but not freedom. The secret he'd agreed to bury with Meghan Markle didn't just fade into the past. It became the invisible force shaping both their futures. For Meghan, it meant total control over her public image. For Trevor, it meant living with a truth he could never speak aloud. But as Meghan's fame rose and her life grew more public, the cost of that silence began to climb. Every new headline, every interview, every carefully crafted speech about authenticity reminded Trevor of what he'd given up to protect her. After the night of the fire, when Meghan burned the documents that tied her to a life she claimed no longer existed, Trevor tried to move forward. He focused on his career, throwing himself into producing projects and expanding his contacts in Hollywood. Meghan, meanwhile, began to change. It wasn't overnight. It was gradual, deliberate. She refined her accent, rebranded her personality, and started to talk about her career with a kind of certainty that made people listen. She told friends she wanted to be a voice that mattered. For a while, Trevor admired that ambition. But beneath the admiration, a quiet resentment began to grow. He knew what she had buried to get here. He knew the secret that lay underneath her polished exterior. And yet, he couldn't say a word. He was bound by a promise. An unspoken, uneasy deal that kept them both prisoners in different ways. The deal, as Trevor's confidants would later describe it, wasn't sealed with paperwork or contracts. It was emotional, psychological. Meghan had a way of turning truth into a weapon. When Trevor confronted her about the things she'd erased, she didn't plead or threaten. She reasoned. She told him that revealing the truth would destroy not only her but him as well. She painted a picture of mutual ruin, of scandal and humiliation. And in that twisted symmetry, she found her leverage. "Do you want to be known as the man who ruined someone's life?" she once asked him, according to one insider. "Because that's what will happen if you talk." Trevor didn't talk. He didn't dare. Instead, he made a choice that would define the next decade of his life. He kept the secret locked inside, convincing himself that silence was the right thing. But silence, like guilt, grows heavier over time. As Meghan's career gained momentum, her need for control deepened. She began to scrutinize Trevor's professional decisions, urging him to avoid certain topics in his films, certain scripts that hit too close to home. When a producer once approached Trevor with a project about a celebrity hiding a secret child, Meghan reacted sharply. "Don't even think about it," she said. "You know how the industry loves gossip. They'll twist it." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were cold. Trevor turned down the project. But he couldn't turn off the unease that came with living under her rules. He began to feel like an accomplice in a cover-up he didn't fully understand. When friends asked why he looked tired all the time, he brushed it off. But privately, he was unraveling. He couldn't shake the image of the envelope, the documents turning to ash, the certainty in Meghan's voice when she said, "That part of my life doesn't exist anymore." The weight of that secret changed him. He became quieter, less trusting. His friends noticed the difference. One described him as haunted, like he was always watching his words. Another said he seemed trapped between love and fear. Meghan, however, thrived. She was on the rise, landing her breakout role on Suits and quickly becoming a media darling. For every piece of her past that had been erased, a new, flawless narrative took its place. When she spoke about empowerment and authenticity in interviews, the world applauded. But for Trevor, those moments were a knife to the chest. He knew the truth she'd buried, the lie that underpinned the story everyone now celebrated. He wasn't angry, at least not at first. He was exhausted. He began to wonder if protecting her had ever really been about love, or if it had always been about fear. As her fame grew, so did her distance from him. Meghan's transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. She became colder, more calculating, more protective of her reputation than of their marriage. When Trevor questioned her about the constant need to manage everything, she accused him of not understanding what it takes to survive. He tried to remind her that success didn't have to mean secrecy, but she dismissed him. "You don't know what people will do if they find out," she said one night, her voice trembling with something between anger and panic. "You think they'll forgive, but they won't. They'll destroy me." Trevor wanted to comfort her, to tell her that whatever she'd done, he'd stand by her. But part of him knew she wasn't talking about guilt. She was talking about exposure. She wasn't afraid of being wrong. She was afraid of being found out. Their relationship began to fracture. The silence that once protected them now poisoned every conversation. Every argument ended with the same unspoken reminder. He knew something he wasn't allowed to say. At one point, Trevor considered walking away, not from the marriage but from Hollywood altogether. He wanted a clean start, far from the endless performance of secrets. But Meghan wouldn't allow it. She told him they were better as a team, that she needed his loyalty and his presence. To her, Trevor wasn't just a husband, he was an anchor, a witness, and a liability. So he stayed, at least for a while. He stayed through the premieres, the interviews, the red carpets. He stayed even when he knew their love had become a contract of silence. But inside, something in him began to shift. The more she thrived, the more he realized that the deal he'd made wasn't mutual. Meghan had freed herself by trapping him. By the time their marriage ended, Trevor had stopped trying to understand her. He'd accepted that some people build their lives not on truth but on illusion, and that for Meghan, illusion wasn't deception, it was survival. The secret she'd made him bury wasn't just about her past. It was about her entire identity. After the divorce, he tried to leave it behind. He never spoke publicly about Meghan, not even when provoked. But privately, the guilt lingered. He couldn't forget the fire, the papers, the name Joe Giuliano. He couldn't unsee the way she'd looked at him when she made him promise to stay silent. It was a look that said she knew she'd won. Years later, when the world watched Meghan marry Prince Harry, Trevor stayed quiet. But those who knew him well say he watched from afar, his expression unreadable. One friend asked if it bothered him to see her living that life. Trevor's answer was simple. "It's not the life that bothers me, it's the lie that built it." He knew then that silence had protected her long enough. And slowly, the thought began to take root. Maybe it was time to speak. Not to destroy her, but to finally free himself. Because secrets don't die when they're buried. They grow, waiting for the moment someone is brave enough to unearth them. And Trevor Engelson, after 19 years of silence, was finally ready to dig. As Meghan Markle's career began to take off, she transformed with precision, like a sculptor chiseling away every trace of her old self. The Meghan Trevor had met, raw, emotional, unpolished, was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone colder, more composed, and far more strategic. It was as if she'd studied the mechanics of reinvention and applied them to every detail of her existence. Her wardrobe changed, her voice softened, Even her handwriting evolved, slanted and refined, like someone trying to look royal before she ever knew she'd become one. Trevor watched all this from close range, at first with admiration, then with growing unease. He'd known ambitious people before. This was Hollywood, after all. But Meghan's determination went beyond ambition. It was survival. She wasn't just building a career. She was constructing a new identity. And as he began to realize, part of that process involved erasing anyone or anything that didn't fit the image she wanted the world to see. When Meghan landed the role on Suits, it felt like the turning point she had always been waiting for. She moved to Toronto for filming, and Trevor stayed behind in Los Angeles to manage his production work. At first, they promised to see each other often to make the distance work. But distance wasn't the problem, disconnection was. Meghan was thriving in a new world, surrounded by new people who knew nothing about her past, nothing about Joe Giuliano, and nothing about the secret Trevor had been forced to bury. In that new environment, Meghan became someone else entirely. She was poised, elegant, and fiercely protective of her image. She started granting carefully scripted interviews, always repeating the same themes: hard work, independence, compassion. To the public, she was an inspiration. To Trevor, she was unrecognizable. He once told a friend that watching her interviews felt like listening to a stranger using her face. What unsettled him most wasn't the change itself, but the consistency of it. Every answer, every gesture, every laugh seemed rehearsed. She'd built a version of herself so perfect it was almost artificial. Trevor, who had known the real woman, the one who once sobbed quietly over rejection letters, who once panicked over unpaid rent, began to feel invisible. Still, he kept her secret. Even as her fame grew, even as he watched her life morph into a narrative that excluded him entirely, he stayed silent. He told himself it was for the best. But the silence began to corrode him from within. Back in Los Angeles, friends noticed how withdrawn he'd become. When asked about Meghan, he smiled politely and said she was doing great. But privately, he was struggling. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had married with the public figure she'd become. And every time he saw her name in a headline, he remembered the fire, the night she burned her past in front of him, erasing it as if it had never happened. It was during this time that Trevor began to understand the true meaning of control. Meghan's transformation wasn't just about image management. It was about rewriting history. She wasn't content to move on from her past. She wanted to obliterate it. She hired new PR teams, distanced herself from old acquaintances, and subtly rewrote parts of her personal biography. In interviews, she spoke about growing up as a mixed-race girl in Hollywood, navigating identity and adversity, but she never mentioned Joe Giuliano, never mentioned certain years that seemed to vanish from her timeline. To the world, her story was clean, inspiring, and perfectly symmetrical. To Trevor, it was missing entire pages. When he tried to talk to her about it, she brushed him off. "The past doesn't serve me anymore," she said. "It's gone." But it wasn't gone for Trevor. It lived in his mind like a recurring dream he couldn't escape. The deal they had made, the silence he had agreed to, chained him to that buried truth. Every time he thought about speaking up, he heard her voice again. "You don't understand what's at stake." The further Meghan climbed, the smaller Trevor felt. He'd once been her confidant, her partner. Now he was just a loose thread in the story she was weaving, a thread that needed to remain invisible. Things began to deteriorate between them. Meghan's career demanded her full attention, and Trevor became an afterthought. Calls went unanswered. Visits were postponed. When he did fly to Toronto, she was distracted, more focused on her schedule than on their marriage. The emotional distance between them grew into something physical, palpable, like an invisible wall he couldn't breach. It all came to a head one night during an argument that friends say marked the beginning of the end. Trevor had brought up the secrecy, the silence, the way she'd isolated herself from everyone who knew her before fame. "You're turning into someone I don't even know," he said. Meghan's reply was sharp, almost cruel. "Maybe you never really knew me at all." Those words cut deep because, in a way, she was right. The woman he thought he knew had ceased to exist. The one standing before him was an invention, flawless, poised, untouchable. After that, their marriage unraveled quickly. Meghan's rising fame left little room for compromise. When she was in Los Angeles, she was busy networking. When she was in Toronto, she was surrounded by a new world that didn't include him. The calls became shorter, the visits fewer, until one day they simply stopped trying. The divorce, when it came, was quiet. Meghan kept it clinical, no drama, no emotion. She told mutual friends they had simply grown apart. But for Trevor, it felt like being erased from someone's life in real time. Within weeks, she had moved on. But the strangest thing, Trevor later told a close confidant, was how thorough the erasure was. Photos vanished from her social media. Mentions of him disappeared from interviews. It was as though their years together had been deleted, not just from her story, but from the public record. It wasn't until after the divorce that Trevor began to understand just how carefully Meghan had orchestrated everything. The transformation hadn't been spontaneous. It had been strategic. She'd created a narrative clean enough to withstand scrutiny, even royal scrutiny, as it would later turn out. For Trevor, the realization came with a strange mixture of awe and fear. He admired her discipline even as it terrified him. She wasn't just building an image. She was building armor. And every secret she buried became another layer of protection. Years later, when Meghan met Prince Harry, Trevor watched the headlines with quiet disbelief. He knew how much of her past she had erased to reach that point. He wondered if Harry knew, if he had any idea how carefully constructed the woman beside him was. But Trevor stayed silent, just as he always had. Still, the guilt never left him. The secret he'd helped bury, the one tied to Joe Giuliano, the one that burned away in that fireplace, haunted him. He told himself it wasn't his story to tell. But deep down, he knew that by keeping quiet, he had become part of the lie. As Meghan's life became more public, Trevor's world shrank. He stopped attending certain events, stopped speaking to people who might ask questions. But the more he tried to move on, the louder the past seemed to call.